Let's start. And if other people join, then we'll include them. So welcome into the first in the second part of the series of distinguished addresses. Initially, when we conceptualized them, we referred to them as masterclasses, but that term is problematic because of the title of masterclasses. So that's why they call distinguished addresses. So welcome, I'm Hári Sewell. You'll be with me this afternoon. Well, it's evening now. And the session's designed with a bit of space later on for us to be in dialogue with each other, and would kind of rather think of it as being in dialogue rather than a Q&A session. To put this into context, as you are probably aware, we have the website Decolpsych, a rich collection of resources from Dr. Suman Fernando and people from indigenous communities and backgrounds, some written pieces and some videos that really deal with the subject of decolonizing psychiatry, psychology, and mental health more broadly. And in support of that website, we've got this series of distinguished addresses. Last year, we had one by Dr. Fernando to launch the series of 6, and we've just, having gone through the back end of last year, come out the other side and put some work in to get the remainder of the series mapped out. On the last slide, I've got a flyer with all of the other speakers. You'll probably have seen that as part of your process of getting to this one, but I'll invite you to kind of consider booking onto the others if you haven't yet done so. So I'll save that bit for the end. At this stage, I just want to say thanks to the rest of the team, Dr. Raisa, Kumaga, and Dr. Fernando, who are kind of core people alongside myself, who have been working not just on the series, but to keep the Decolpsych website alive. And then we have a broader team of people who have kind of been there as a reference, and just kind of want to acknowledge them. This isn't just the kind of Hári Sewell show. Also want to thank my esteemed colleague, Rebecca, who's been the person who's got us to this stage with all of the events mapped out and all the materials prepared and so forth, and absolutely definitely couldn't be here without the support of Rebecca. So thank you. So that's it. Just by way of all of the intros. I guess one thing that matters to us in our spaces is about having an inclusive space, and also one where there is a degree of psychological safety. And there are certain things that often emerge in our conversations about psychological safety, kind of including the respect that we might expect to extend to each other, the usual courtesies of not speaking over each other, and if there's something that's contributed, if we disagree, to kind of do so without being disagreeable. And that if something is reflected back, unlikely that might happen, but if it does, that we see that as an act of kindness. If someone just reflects something back that we might go and think about, rather than landing in a defensive place, it kind of really helps. And just to just try and accept that we can be ourselves in the space. What also matters in being inclusive is recognizing that on occasions we might be asked to go over something, or to write something in the chat, or to find different ways to meet whatever needs that might arise, because we're all different. We process the world differently. Some of us might be neurodivergent. There might be things going on emotionally or physiologically for us that mean something just didn't land. And I just kind of want to make it the norm in the space that we ask for what we want. Doesn't mean we'll always be able to meet that. There's that phrase, ask for what you want with no attachment to the outcome. So yeah, have a go. If we can adapt, then we'll do that. But the goal is to be as inclusive as possible. The final thing from me on psychological safety is just to ask that we don't bring into the space any of the kind of particularly violent words in society. There are some terms, some phrases that don't really fit in normal conversation. People use them to humiliate and dehumanize others. And it's unlikely we're going to get cross and use words like that in relation to each other. But sometimes people bring anecdotes, and in the middle of the anecdote, you might kind of drop a homophobic or transphobic or racist or misogynistic term, because when you heard this thing, it was quite shocking to you, and you want other people in the space to kind of get a sense of how bad this thing was. It really helps if we don't do that, because for people who are on the sharp end of those violent words, the violence is still in the language, even if it's not being targeted specifically at the individual. So it really helps if we don't bring those into the space. So yeah, just kind of want to check in whether or not we're all comfortable with those as a set of principles to guide us through. Excellent. Does anyone have a question for me before we get going? Okay, welcome, Suman. Dr. Fernando's joined. Okay, so if at any point you wish to ask a question, then just feel free to unmute and just gently ask, because as I'm looking at the presentation, I might not catch sight of a hand if you use a digital hand, but please feel free to raise your hand. So as I say, I'll speak for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have some space for conversation. So why have I kind of thought about the amoeba effect, and why that analogy? And I guess it's because one of the things about colonization is that it changes over time. There's a long history of colonization, but the language or the way in which it manifests tends to change shape, and therefore we can occasionally build some responses to decolonizing, psychiatry and psychology and mental health more broadly. We can kind of have approaches, but then things shift, either because the dominant culture shifts or political parties change, or the language that we use changes. Say, for example, the way in which particular groups are referred to changes over time, or the language of dealing with challenges change, either from unconscious bias to cultural competency to, cultural humility or cultural safety. Or even the kind of language of decolonization has become decolonized to become a set of initiatives in organizations where people think it's just about looking at reading lists, or looking at the art on the walls and the places we're working and so forth. Or again, we get this kind of conflation between decolonizing and anti-racism, and because it kind of changes, it's a bit slippery.
That's your friend. My friend. Oh, hello. Okay. He's in England. All right. It's all over the world. This is. Ah, good. He does he do he and others do these lectures.
So I'm just mute Suman there for the moment. So yeah, because it's quite slippery, it's really helpful for us to kind of consider the ways in which it shows up. So it shows up as cultural racism, and the majority of what I talk about is going to be the way in which, I guess, because we're talking a lot around cultural humility and cultural competency now in our services, just kind of want to name how coloniality shows up in terms of cultural racism. Just want to touch also on biological determinism, the way in which the colonial mentality shows up in the way that psychiatric conditions or presentations in people of color is sometimes seen through a biological lens, i.e., there's something genetic, something about the makeup of people, why we end up with, for example, the higher rates than average use of our psychiatric services. Kind of want to think about how science is considered to be objective and how that locates power in the global north, because there are perspectives from indigenous peoples that are often not taken account of, and that links to epistemic racism, the way in which our knowledge systems exclude, the dominant knowledge systems exclude knowledge systems from indigenous people around the world. And then just kind of think briefly about capitalism in mental health. So cultural racism. I guess just starting here, I'll just go back, and it didn't start in this place, but I wanted to start here. Going back to the language of the epidemic of schizophrenia amongst African Caribbeans. And then, so in 2009, there was quite a lot of controversy, including a program on BBC's Panorama, where particular language was used that, for me, captured a sense of how coloniality shows up in the way in which we view different cultures. So Julian Leff, who passed in 2021, was talking about what you and I might refer to the overrepresentation of African Caribbean people in our psychiatric system. And he said, when you get figures like this, you can only call it an epidemic. Then he went on to say, we need a program of social engineering, particularly to strengthen family structures in the African Caribbean community with a view to keeping children in stable families. When you hear that a white professor from outside the community talks about a response to psychiatric kind of admissions and the overrepresentation, and leads with an argument about social engineering and speaks in a judgmental way about the experience of community living and families, you already get a sense of entitlement that someone would feel bold enough to commit this kind of thing to the air. And as I said, it's captured in an article in The Guardian from 2009. Additionally, it goes on to describe, does the article, that though the issues are controversial, he admits touching on sensitive issues such as the number of African Caribbean families with absent fathers, but it's very clear, says Gillian Leff, there are genuinely high rates of schizophrenia, and the causes are social, affecting people before they come into contact with mental health services, and kind of goes back and loops back into that conversation about family life. That's just an entry point into examining this whole issue of how cultures that might not conform to what is considered to be the dominant culture in the UK or considered to be the right way of being are often seen as problematic. And as I said before, with a sense of entitlement spoken about with judgmental language that doesn't actually do anything to endear those communities to the services or to increase the likelihood that services will feel confident, that communities, sorry, will feel confident that when they come into contact with services, that they'll be respected and get the kind of treatment and care that they might be seeking. So rather than helping the situation, it alienates communities. And that is just kind of one example. The next thing I wanted to talk about around culture, again, Julian Leff was central to some of the conversations about high expressed emotion, though it wasn't something that emerged from his research. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept of high expressed emotion, it was an idea based on research that people who were discharged from hospital back into families where there was a lot of criticality, a lot of critical comments that people felt made to feel as though they were a problem, that there was a demand on the family, that kind of high expressed emotion was seriously linked to increased likelihood of relapse. So that language was presented of high expressed emotion. After that, there was additional work undertaken to recognize that it isn't a universal concept to describe something as high expressed emotion. So you will know from your own experience, for example, that there are some ways of talking amongst your family or in your friendship circle where to someone from the outside, they might be a little bit alarmed and say, like, how could you speak to them like that, either in that tone or that language or that force? But if that's part of your normal family culture, then to the outsider, it might look as though it's quite strong. But to you, it might just be an everyday way of communicating. So further work was undertaken, and other theorists have kind of said, well, you've got this concept developed by Brown, etc., around high expressed emotion, but it isn't a universally applied concept, or as a bare minimum, we need to recognize that we can't judge particular behaviors as high expressed emotion if, for example, in one particular study, someone from a Sri Lankan background was saying, well, actually, this is the way we speak to each other routinely. But to the researcher, it might seem as though it's high expressed emotions. So we wouldn't consider this particular way of dialoguing problematic. So some of my colleagues did some work just saying we need to pay attention to the way in which different cultures communicate. And there's no single meaning of high expressed emotion. But what that did, and I remember in the 1980s, the 1990s, the language of high expressed emotion became quite routine in our mental health services, with a belief that there were certain groups who had routinely high expressed emotion, and rather than seeing it as a routine way of communicating that didn't automatically mean it was something problematic, it was actually used as a reinforcement to suggest that the rates of overrepresentation of particular communities related to the fact that those communities, almost by their own admission, acknowledge that they have high expressed emotion. So I don't know if you can kind of see the kind of trick that occurred in that conceptualization, where it wasn't seen as though this is a valid form of expression that has a different meaning. It was seen as particular communities underlining and owning up to the fact that their cultural norms did this problematic thing, which was high expressed emotion. And as a consequence, that was then used as an explanatory model, not the only, but one of the explanatory models for why there was overrepresentation in the system. This idea that, well, we're seeing this overrepresentation partly because these communities are likely to have high expressed emotion. So there's another example of how coloniality and that kind of supremacy idea of there is a right way of being, and then cultural forms that are shaped differently are seen as problematic and linked to the overrepresentation. Then I want to touch on cannabis psychosis. So some of you may well be aware that there was in the 1980s, a problematic concept of cannabis psychosis. And sometimes when I have conversations with groups I'm working with, and I'll just kind of ask, like, based on your understanding of the world, which social groups do you think ended up with that diagnosis more than any other? And there you can kind of see it in one research paper there by McGovern and colleagues, identifying that people from African Caribbean backgrounds were 95 times more likely to receive that diagnosis of cannabis psychosis. And this is linked to so many things that have appeared throughout the course of colonialism and the colonial footprint, starting with the kind of concept of drapetomania by Samuel A. Cartwright in 1851, who came up with that term, drapetomania, to describe the experience of African-American enslaved people who fled from the plantations where they were being enslaved. And that was conceptualized as some kind of mental illness, all the way through to the work done by Jonathan Metzl in the book The Protest Psychosis: How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, and his research that identified the way in which the presentation and conceptualization of schizophrenia changed around the civil rights movement. And he was able to map out very clearly how people's anger or people's resistance to oppression was reframed as something that was a sign of a mental illness. So getting to cannabis psychosis is on that same pathway of the colonial footprint showing up in cultures that are demonized, and there are associations created between social groups and diagnosis like cannabis psychosis. What we do know about the use of cannabis is that it's widespread across all communities, that there is some small differential between communities, but it wouldn't justify the differences in the rate of diagnosis for African Caribbean people. And as I said, 95 times more likely to be diagnosed, tells us that these processes are situated in a dominant social culture that still finds ways to look at something that is considered to be alien, different, or problematic, and to sweep it up within the psychiatric system. And, we've kind of seen that, going back to the Holocaust, the way in which psychiatry has been used as a system of social control. So I guess it's just worth acknowledging that cultural discrimination is and could be inseparable from racism and that legacy of colonialism, that it isn't just about looking at different cultures and holding them with disdain. That is what coloniality and that's what racism looks like. And of course, the thing about culture is that it isn't just birth, death, and marriages, how people eat and bathe and worship. It's completely interwoven with every aspect of human life, including biology. So how does coloniality show up in terms of the link with biology? Fanon said that people of color, that Black people are considered to be non-beings. And that is a theme that has run through many of the cases that we've seen in psychiatric deaths in custody, and language that suggests that people from Black and other racialized backgrounds are not fully formed human beings. And in fact, if you go back to the first conceptualization of race as a concept, the language was designed to create a hierarchy with whiteness at the top and then other groups somewhere lower down with Black people at the bottom of this hierarchy. And, this idea that these others were not fully formed human beings. And I guess I'm just naming that because a lot of people who interact with the language of race are unaware that race is a relatively recent construct, kind of started to be peppered around in the 1600s, Bernier in 1684. And then later on, people like Carl Linnaeus, Arthur de Gobineau, Charles White, developed these taxonomies, these classification systems that attempted to put humans into discrete categories known as racial groups. Up until then, the characteristics that we might associate with racial identities like hair type, skin tone, etc., would have been considered to be just signifiers of difference, but without particular associations bolted onto them. Sonia Shah, in her book, The Next Great Migration, said it's a bit like hair color is now, where we'll notice it, but we don't think that that tells us everything there is to know about another human being. Whereas we know that in 1850, Knox gave a speech in Edinburgh. He was a contemporary of Darwin and said, race stampeth a man. And the kind of whole speech suggested that you can tell everything about another human being, their culture, and their biology based on their racialized identity. So we got to a point where there was this deep belief reinforced in academic journals and in pseudoscientific research that suggests that you have whiteness and then you have these other beings. That thread has continued to run through the experiences of people, as I say, who have died in custody, in our psychiatric services. I haven't got Shani Lewis on this slide, but I could have included Shani Lewis. For those of you who don't know, Olushani was a graduate. He had his first episode of what was described as psychosis, was picked up by the police and taken to Section 133, a place of safety suite in the Maudsley hospital area. And he was restrained by the police in there, and he was unconscious, and he was left, wasn't attended to, not by the police. There were nursing staff because it was on a ward, adjacent to a ward, and they didn't attend to him because there was a belief that he was faking it, even though he was unconscious and he was left to die. So as you probably know, there's kind of been the law around the Use of Force Act, which has kind of responded to many cases like with Sean Rigg and others, where there's evidence that excessive force has been used. So Suman Fernando, who is online here, has kind of written about the fact that, there's been so many attempts through research to identify a biological explanation for why there is the kind of overrepresentation and the kind of serious use, disproportionate use of mental health services by people from Black backgrounds. And there's been never, ever has there been any research, conclusive research, to find a biological explanation apart from the one around infections and kind of, relating to migration. And even that is kind of, inconclusive as a specifically racialized pattern. So we live in a world where there is not a biological explanation that you can kind of say is scientific, but there's still a belief system that maybe one of the explanations is to do with something that is biologically determined. Additionally, it's worth noting that whereas we often think about admissions to psychiatric units being related to presentations of mental illness, or whichever language you might use to describe that, the reality is that the reason why people are admitted is because of an assessment or a perception of risk. And it's worth holding that really clear in our minds, that there are many people who might have conditions that you'd say are psychiatric conditions, but if the risks don't breach acceptable thresholds, then they won't be admitted. So when we see disproportionate numbers of people being admitted, it's helpful for us to backtrack and go, well as a kind of condition that they might have, what is the presentation in their behavior that means that their risk threshold is seen to have breached acceptable and tolerable levels? And so up here, I've got the Big Black and Dangerous quote, which comes from the report into the death of Orville Blackwood and others in Broadmoor High Secure Hospital in the 1980s. And the reason why Big Black and Dangerous is in quotes is because the team who undertook the investigation into the circumstances of his death repeatedly described him and other Black patients as big, black, and dangerous, seeming to tap in to a belief system about the risk associated with people who look like that. Marcia Rigg, Sean Rigg's sister, Sean Rigg, as you might know, also died in police custody. He was a man with mental health problems. The judge in the case of Sean Rigg said, well, it was clear that the police had used excessive force in his case, and that at some level it seems as though he was treated as an animal. And that is a language that seems to come up in many of the cases where you might say the force being used or the approach links in to what Frantz Fanon was suggesting around people being non-beings, the kind of lack of empathy. You also find it in concepts like the discredited idea of excited delirium syndrome, which some of you may well have gone away and done your research, having listened to John Ronson's podcast, and that kind of led me down, not a rabbit hole, but seriously kind of being curious about how that's used. Again, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of excited delirium, which has no foundation whatsoever in research and in science, is the idea that Black men, African American men, if they become aroused, and it was linked to the use of crack cocaine, but it's kind of been extended beyond that. If Black men become aroused, they can develop this kind of superhuman strength and this kind of high level of adrenaline rush, which then kind of creates this threat for anyone around them, including anyone who might be in a role of restraining them. And there's a kind of a whole backstory about how that's been used as a defense in the use of tasers that actually what happened is that the officers would argue they saw this black man in America, an African-American man, in a state of excited delirium, and therefore it was justifiable for them to, use tasers, and that includes occasions when people have died in the use of tasers. And for those of you who have been kind of following this particular story, you'll be aware that the murder of George Floyd included a comment under the breath of one of the officers involved saying, well, look, we were a bit concerned about this excited delirium thing or whatever you call it. And this idea that develops that has no scientific foundation whatsoever, that books are still published on it. If you search it, you'll still find that it is being passported as a real thing, despite there being no evidence at all to support the fact that there's this thing called excited delirium. And it links to that kind of biological approach, because the belief that there is something intrinsic to being a black man that means that you're likely to develop a superhuman strength that then legitimizes the use of force, which in any other circumstance you might consider to be excessive. And when we kind of think about how that shows up and that kind of imprint of coloniality, I just kind of wanted to talk about the fact that we often imagine it shows up as thought processes, but indeed it shows up in embodied ways. And Menachem in the book My Grandmother's Hands kind of describes many ways in which we carry these embodied ideas around race and racialization and the kind of legacy of the colonial footprint. And it shows up in our feelings, and collectively it means that we respond in particular situations, including in psychiatric services, where it isn't even as though we are cognitively imagining something about another, that our bodies will react. So like the use of force is sometimes something which is an embodied response. I'll give you one example of in the book Race Talk, Dale Wing-Sue described the situation in supermarkets in the States. And he said, black customers might be in a queue. This was when cash was acceptable. And they might notice that the checkout staff would give the cash into the hands of the customers who were white, who were ahead of them in the queue. And then when it became their turn to give and receive their cash change, they noticed that the staff who were white would either put the money down on the side or would kind of hover a bit above their hands and kind of drop the change into their palms. And often when I say this, I notice when I've got my screens up, I can kind of see people of color nodding and smiling as something they recognize when I talk about this. So that's an example of the embodied nature of these racist ideas, that if you were to ask the checkout staff, why is it that you seem to not want to come into physical contact with your customers who are African American, that they would probably say, but I don't have that as an issue. They would say, well, my best friend's black, or, my best friend's cousin is black. And they would think that it's unlikely that they'd demonstrate that kind of behavior, but it shows up. And, it shows up as someone who uses public transport a lot because of my work. I know that one of the tickets that I get for being inside my own body is that I have a longer period of time when the seat beside me will stay vacant. And I don't think that people walk into the carriage and say, oh, he's black, I don't want to sit beside him. But something in their bodies just kind of think that they'll wait until they're pretty much down to the last seat. Then they might sit there. Otherwise, they're going to keep walking through to avoid that proximity. So it's really worth our while understanding that that colonial legacy that then kind of shows up in the otherness of people of color isn't just cognitive, because we often talk about like the language of unconscious bias, or we said or we thought these things, but it sits with feelings and it sits with these embodied behaviors, which in the way I've described it is about bypassing the cognition and landing in ways that we haven't even thought we've been doing. So how does the kind of footprint of coloniality show up? kind of going back to some of the other areas that we're talking about around knowledge systems, and the objectivity or the supposed objectivity of our knowledge systems. And that's kind of really important, because as I've said, what we end up with is a situation where the ideas of that mind body dualism that was postulated by Rene Descartes, or the body spirit, to be accurate, through my conversations with Suman, the body spirit dualism, and the idea that we exist as separate systems, including that separateness from the external world. That is the foundation of psychiatry, and it's just worth naming that again. The idea that you can treat the mind as a separate entity from the body is the foundation of our psychiatric system. And that belief then runs, the fact that we have created this idea of the mind as something which is biological that could then be responded to and treated through psychopharmacology. That underpins the basis of modern psychiatry in the global north. And it's presented as if it's objective, and it's presented as if it has universal transferability. And there is a hierarchy which, based on our kind of methodologies in research, as you know, randomized controlled trials is the kind of gold standard. And we've got all these ideas of suggesting that we can arrive at a point where there is pure science. But as we've kind of touched on already this evening, is that everything is situated, everything is culturally situated, and therefore will be a reflection of the fact that any process that includes human beings will include a cultural bias. And we end up with let me move on, the globalization of psychiatry around the world, including some of the research done by the World Health Organization going back to 1978, where the kind of belief was that if only we could passport the models, including the models of prescribing to the rest of the world, that would see advances, and it would be presented as an ethical argument, but it's kind of strongly linked to the capitalist argument that I kind of get to, that there is a vested interest in the globalization of psychiatry because of that close relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the systems that we're working within. So there's a vested interest. And if you extend your market to the global south, to the rest of the world, then of course you increase the likelihood that money will be made. It serves the corporations, but it also serves nation states in terms of tax revenue. So this quote I really like. It's from a book called Inflamed. And that second part, colonialism has altered our relationship to knowing and understanding. And that quote is in the context of the way in which there are stories that are told amongst indigenous peoples about their experiences of pain, the impact of racism, and so forth. And that is often not given much value because it might be passed off as just anecdotes. So qualitative research that will capture those stories is seen as less significant than randomized controlled trials and findings from those sources. And what's striking to me as someone who's been involved in this work for quite a while is that more recently we've seen papers, the meta-analysis by Pérez and colleagues, the synergy enterprise that was kind of looking at the impact of racism on mental well-being. And we now have this body of research that says racism is a toxin and it's really bad for you and it makes you sick. And I kind of think, well, it's interesting that it now seems to have currency because that's been published in academic journals. That's been said by people who have authority and have been sanctioned by the systems in our universities and in our academic journals. So because it's said by those people, it has currency, whereas communities have been saying racism makes us sick for years. And that's where that quote from Maran Patel in the book Inflamed fits in about colonialism's altered our relationship with knowing and understanding, that it doesn't seem to have meaning to us unless we can quote which journal we read it in. So what we also see is that hegemonic forms of practice um, from the global north, from the west, are passported around the world. And it's seen as though they could be passported with very little adaptation. And again, it's that belief that anything that we develop in the global north has a kind of degree of universality about it. And that again is linked to that possibility, as I just said, for the development of revenue. So where this kind of takes us to is the recognition that decolonizing is not just one thing, that whether we're looking at knowledge, research, how there's a kind of biological dimension to it, biological essentialism or biological determinism, or whether it's kind of looking at cultural racism and how that footprint or that legacy of coloniality shows up, that it kind of changes form. And any one time, you might be attending to one dimension, and around the corner, it's just kind of changing form. And it's just that preparedness for us to keep our eyes and ears open and pay attention. And clearly, it's not something we can do on our own. The enterprise requires so much attention and effort that we can only do this through community for the reasons that I've kind of said. So I'm going to take the slides down. I'm going to come back to that last slide there with the other speakers in the series, just to remind you, please do book on to the rest of the series or individual talks. And also please note that there's a contributions page on the Decolpsych website. There's so much rich material on there. It's like a library, but it's just a website, not just, but it's a website. So that's me for now. Any questions?
I think there were some comments in the chat, actually, some questions.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, Jupitermania. Oh, okay, all right, thanks. I was answering that. Oh, can I get the slides? Yeah, I guess.
Can I ask a question, Hári?
Elsie. Oh, yeah, okay, Sue and then Elsie.
Yeah, just with what I've heard, I was just kind of, thinking about experiences and family members that have gone through services where they were ended up in psychiatric units and through sort of, misdemeanors, basically, something that just occurred that shouldn't have occurred. And then it just catapulted into them being whisked into, I don't mind sharing, sorry, I know it's a space and it's been recorded, and that they've been catapulted into a psychiatric unit and no one's consulted, and then they're being given injections and different types of treatments to the brain and what have you. And I was just listening to the background to what you were saying about how people are perceived. And then, so what I wanted to ask was, with this information you're sharing now, how is this information being introduced into the services that, police force, healthcare systems, is this being introduced into, the information you're sharing now, into those types of services that have the power to, put people into mental health institutions and so on?
Great, thanks. So the challenge around this work, and I find this in academia, is that in order to progress either in your profession or through academia, you need to demonstrate a grasp of the orthodoxy of whatever you're working with. You need to be able to, either quote or act in a way that demonstrates you've got a good grasp of the knowledges and the systems that are revered in the profession. So if you want to progress, so to put it in a straightforward way, I can talk to my students about be critical in your thinking, but I also need to teach them the texts and the ideas that I know they need to include in their papers in order for them to get really good grades in order to progress. And we're kind of then caught in this double bind where you're intellectually holding a different view, and you would say maybe to the students, or you'd say to your colleagues, actually you need to think critically. But at the same time, if, for example, you're someone who's young and you wanted to progress in the mental health services, you wouldn't be able to stand outside of it with a very critical perspective like the ones that I've brought. So the answer to your question is, these ideas are spoken about, but it's really hard to advance them, because even people who have a critical perspective have a vested interest in still maintaining the status quo. And that's the nature of the colonial enterprise, is that it will continue to serve itself and embed itself for the reasons I've just said. So yeah, there are a lot of books written about this, a lot of talks, a lot of work going on. It's never going to be in the main.
Thank you.
Elsie.
Yes, Hári, thank you very much for the depth of this talk. And, you know, honestly, I'd like to hear it again, because there is so much in it. But my question really was, and I want to thank Sue for asking it, because that's where I'm at. So I am a governor of a public governor for mental health trust, my local mental health trust. They declare themselves as an anti-racist trust. And I really would like for some of this knowledge, this information, to be shared. And, you know, it's all right for what, you know, academics is one thing, but the actual clinical interface, which is where the difference is made for people, for all people, but more especially for people who have disparate outcomes. You know, those are the things that are really, really critically important. And also remembering the fact that the NHS is really struggling now. You know, so I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we bring that to the clinical space.
Yeah, I do. I'm really, really clear. Luckily, I'm not talking on a trust paycheck right now, so I can just tell you exactly how things are. The reality is, Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never be good to dismantle the master's house. That we can't expect to be within the system and to get funding, to get support, to dismantle the very thing that is funding our way through it. And what we therefore need to do is to find places of activism where people's livelihoods aren't linked to the very ideas that we're trying to dismantle. Literally, that is what we need to do, is to build up networks of activists, including you know, people in our local communities or people overseas, to bring different perspectives, to say things that we can't. I remember when I was an executive director in the NHS, and somebody who was the lead for lived experience, he used to say, can I have a conversation? We'd meet in a cafe and he'd say, you know, the board meeting's next week. I'm going to ask this question. It's going to be really tricky for you. But I need to ask it, because if I don't, you're not going to get enough resources to do this thing that you need to do. So I'd go into the board meeting, I'd kind of know what my response is going to be, and I'd have this really tricky question. And it kind of sounds like, oh, is that playing politics? It's like, yes, because that's exactly what the system works on. And that is the point, is that sometimes we need to work with people outside the system who can say or ask or provoke in ways that we can't. So you can kind of, you know, even just say, look, I know there's some information, it's not out there yet. And someone knows that, and they can turn up at a board meeting and say, do you have any data on X and Y? And unless someone is going to be bold and just lie, then there is a comment about, well, yeah, we have, it's not finalized, but when it is, we'll send it to you, or whatever it is. There are ways of creating change, but to expect to get significant change within the system is unrealistic. Time and time again, we've seen that.
Hári, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can, yes. Actually, it's about 6 months since I attended a Zoom meeting, and I've sort of lost the hang of it quite a lot. I wasn't sure how to get, I must say, firstly, I'm sorry for interrupting your talk early with my nurse who didn't really know what was going on. Came and talked to me. Anyway, it was very good talk. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I can see how far you've got in many ways, you personally, and also your colleagues. I'd like to say the questions raised again were very good because it put you on the spot a bit. Where is change being made? My impression is an impression because I'm right out of touch with people, is that there's a lot of work going on overseas in people who are often sent and funded by very radical and sort of far-thinking groups. Like, there's the the trust, the Wellcome Trust, and there are others which I won't name, which are continuously battling away to actually say what I could say very simply, that look outside the West, look outside Britain particularly, and the US, because they are very powerful nations, and look where the information is coming from, work being done outside the Western nations, outside Europe, in Africa, in South America, in South Africa, in where they do get some support, but most of the time they're fighting their funders, actually. I can't say much more because actually my vocabulary is very poor now. My own illnesses have been very effective in that way. But that's what I would say. Try to take people's interest away from what's going on here. I know the NHS is going through a bad time, but there are lots of places where things are a good time. It's a good time because there's work being done, and other cultures, if you like, put it in culture, but other cultures have a lot to teach us, and that's where we ought to be looking. But the politics of this is so frightening, actually, because all sorts of maneuvers are used by the Western academic people to actually suppress that sort of information taking a hold. Thank you for your lecture. Anyway, it's really refreshing to listen to this, and hope you continue this work.
Thanks, Suman. So just for everyone else's benefit, just to put this into context, so Suman's going to be off camera blushing, but Suman's kind of my mentor, who's kind of, since I was wearing short trousers almost, been there, both in text and as a good friend, whose work has really shaped the way in which I approach this work. So when Suman says, "Oh, thanks," I kind of think, "Oh." So thank you, Suman. And yeah, Suman won't mind telling you how old he is, still here taking part and producing amazing thought pieces. But you can keep upping the numbers. You probably won't even get to where you could imagine he is. What's after an oxygenarian? What's the next one up? An octogenarian? So we're just on the cusp of closing. If you do have anything else, then please do ask. But I just want to return to this slide. Sue had written into the chat, will there be any more? So as you can see, the next in the series is going to be on the 14th of March by Pedro Andres Pérez and Rothstein, and that's kind of great London perspective, but obviously with an Indigenous perspective. And then after that, we've got the 27th of March, where we've got Dr. Roberta K Timothy, who resides in Toronto at the minute in Canada. So I hope you can join those then. I mentioned Dr. Tony Sam George on the 15th, and then Dr. Raisa Kumaga, who has been working with Suman and I on developing the series alongside Rebecca, who you heard me refer to earlier on. So please do see if you can get to all of those, or either or any of them. Be really, really great. Up until today, we've been running a concessionary rate for the entire series. I think we've still got the 50% code on. So please, book and use that code. And you can kind of join the others. It's such a good bargain that if you even only make 2 more, you're still going to be up. So it's definitely worth doing that. At the moment, HS Consultancy funds the kind of marketing and all the fees for the website and all of that. So there is no funding source. This is for the love of the work. The fees from these events doesn't really cover our overheads, but we still do it for the love of the work. So please do support, and thanks for those of you who have bought places. Just to close by echoing what Suman Fernando, Dr. Fernando said, be curious as to why it is that when we think about the knowledges that we draw upon, it's often restricted to the global north. And think about the whole rest of the globe. What else are people doing? Because people are clever out there. Let's go find out a bit more about what they're doing. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day wherever you're at.
Thank you, Hári.
Thank you, Hári.
Thank you. That was so rich and interesting. Thank you. See you again for sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hári. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Hári. Thank you
Bye,
very
everyone.
much indeed. Bye now.